We come to the end of ourselves, we meet God in spectacular ways. Well, this week we'll be concluding our series as we've been going through Kyle Idleman's book, The End of Me. For those that may be interested in learning a little bit more about it, I did put it in our library downstairs, so if you want to check it out and get a little more information than what I've been able to share with you in these past several weeks, I encourage you to do so. In this final chapter, Kyle shares the story of Forrest Fenn. Forrest was an 82-year-old eccentric multimillionaire from New Mexico. Forrest filled a treasure chest with $3 million in gold coins, diamonds, and emeralds, and then he buried it somewhere. And then he challenged America to go out and find it. This story started in 1988 when Forrest was diagnosed with cancer. He had decided that he was going to bury this treasure and die somewhere out in the wilderness, leaving this treasure as a legacy. Well, he ended up surviving the cancer. But he decided he was going to go ahead and move forward with his plans. He provided an unusual map to help people find this treasure. His map was a poem that had 9 clues hidden in it. In his autobiography entitled The Thrill of the Chase, Forrest wrote about all the rare and valuable things that he collected over his life. How the real treasure of life, though, is the pursuit itself. By burying this treasure, he was trying to show what he meant by this statement. What he was really saying was, turn off the TV, get away from the video games, do something real for a change, instead of living vicariously of the adventures of fictional people on living room screens. Go after a true prize. Now you have to admit that he has a compelling point here. His challenge has inspired thousands of people to go in quest of his hidden treasure, which so far has eluded all pursuers. People believe that there is something out there for them, but they can't seem to find it. Some people, after enough 50 or 60-hour work weeks, they find it. Recognition, promotion, salary. And after all that, it doesn't really seem like much of a treasure. Others pursue wealth. Some pursue love. But ultimately, we'd like to find a treasure that is truly worth something. The Bible tells us that life's real prize is hidden, much like Forrest's. And you have to know where to search for it. Colossians 3:3 says, "For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God." Paul's telling us in order to live, you have to die first. The end of me is where real life begins. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus closed this greatest sermon of all time by talking about 2 paths. One leading to life and the other to destruction. Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 and 14 says, "Enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate, and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. Here, Jesus gives us the first clue of finding life's greatest treasure. We have to look for a narrow gate, one that's not beautifully decorated or impressive. And once you go through it, expect a tough path, one that's seldom walked by others. It crosses through death, but it leads to life. Bonhoeffer said, when Christ calls someone, he bids them to come and die. We have to admit that death is nobody's favorite word. We tend to tiptoe around it with nicer names, like someone's passed on. They've gone ahead. They crossed the river. They're singing in the eternal choir. Sometimes we even use more jovial terms like they kicked the bucket, they bought the farm, they're pushing up daisies. We either over-soften the term or we make it into a joke. Anything we can do other than take it for what it is. We do everything we can to live in denial of the reality of death. But even so, Jesus is urging us to die, not a physical death, but dying to ourselves. Our culture is all about celebrating ourselves. We spend years heading down the road of living for self instead of dying to it. And it's difficult to admit that we have made the wrong choice. When we have chosen the wrong road, we don't like to acknowledge it to ourselves or to anyone else. And yet, every now and then we hear about wealthy athletes, successful business people, and celebrate performers speaking of struggling with depression, feelings of despair and worthlessness. Wait a minute. They were in the fast lane. They had money and they had fame. How could not they be living this great life? Jesus said there are two paths. One is narrow, difficult, and marked death that leads to life. Bless you. The other path is broad, crowded, and marked with life, but it leads to death. Jesus reminds us in Matthew 16, verses 24 through 25, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me will find it. The key to understanding Jesus' way is through utter surrender, giving up of the old ways, which never would have worked anyway. The journey to the end of yourself requires a completely different way of looking at this world. It's not natural, and it doesn't come easy. We have to ask ourselves, do we decide to live for ourselves, or do we die to ourselves? I'd say that most of us would want to be served, to have our every need met with tender, loving care. We want to be successful and powerful. But Jesus says it's not on the itinerary. Instead, your path goes through those 4 steps. It's catchy. Deny yourself, pick up your cross, Follow him and prepare to die. If you do all of that and you sincerely follow Christ, the craziest thing will happen. You will actually find the one true life. The end of me is where real life begins. In John chapter 13, we find an account that violates every tenet of this world system. It involves service over rule, humility over pride, all of the contradictions that Jesus has been living and teaching us. This narrative takes place in the quiet upper room where Jesus sits with his disciples. It's past sundown on Thursday evening. Some of the men are still mad about a recent argument of who was the greatest. Hearing this, Jesus declines to preach to them another sermon, but instead, he goes and he picks up a towel and he begins to wash their feet. Here, Jesus is surrounded by men that he loves, men that he has molded and taught, who will also abandon him at the first sign of danger. Judas will sell him out for a few coins. Peter, the rock, he'll deny any knowledge of the man that he proclaimed to be the Son of God. Jesus knew all of this, but he still took a towel and he continued to wash their feet. Jesus did the job that was reserved for the lowest of all servants. The disciples saw this task as being below them, so none of them volunteered to do it. And yet Jesus knelt and he scrubbed away. Each day we face is a new narrow gate. The problem with dying to myself is it's a daily thing. We have to make the choice over and over again. I can live for myself, or I can live for Christ, which means picking up my cross, whether it's at the drugstore, at the gas pump, in my living room, or sitting in traffic. Not only must I serve the people that I love and admire, and those who can make my life easier, but dying to myself also means serving those that I don't really like or understand, or even those who have hurt me. If Jesus could wash Judas's feet, then it's time for me to come to the end of myself and follow his example. It's inherently human for us to focus on ourselves. It's how we are. But Jesus teaches us to deny ourselves, to die to ourselves. That doesn't mean it ever becomes easy. Each day we climb out of bed to begin a new day, and each day that old self gets out of bed with us. We have to put on Christ as an act of will over and over again. Now you could keep doing the life the old way, trying to climb the ladder of success, trying to possess, trying to gain. And then Jesus reminds us in Matthew 16:26, what good will it be for someone to gain the whole world and yet forfeit their soul? Only if we follow Jesus, only if we choose the way of the cross and denial of self, can we truly live. Dying to myself and reaching the end of me is meant to be a daily decision and a daily demonstration. Now, if we would truly ask God to put us to work, He would begin pointing out places left and right for us to do stuff, to spring into action. Those places are everywhere. And in denying ourselves, or putting it another way, loving others, it's not an occasional option. It's a way of life that casts its influence over every day. It is God's way of ushering in his kingdom, house by house, face by face, moment by moment. This is the death that we must die. Not a one-time death, not a partial death. It is a daily dying. Every time I come to the end of me, I discover what I deeply wanted all along, and that is real, abundant life in Christ. And when you die to yourself, you will too. Amen.